In Colombia, the National Electoral Council demanded an international audit to the programs used for the organization and scrutiny process of the March 13th elections. Meanwhile, the Congress demanded the resignation of the National Registrar. In Brasilia, thousands of indigenous Brazilians continue their week-long demonstrations to demand their rights and protest against Jair Bolsonaro's government, which seeks to keep the extractive activities. Thousands of Sudanese demonstrators marched in the nation's capital and other cities Wednesday in new protest against a military coup that plunged the African country into political turmoil and aggravated its economic woes. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from the teleSUR studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. Colombia's National Electoral Council demanded an international audit of the computer programs used for the organization and scrutiny of the last March 13th elections, while officials in Congress demanded the resignation of the National Registrar. The Council expressed its concern to the National Registrar, Alexander Vega, due to the several irregularities that occurred during the elections. The National Electoral Council asked for a review of the computer and scrutiny systems at departmental and national level. In view of the celebration of the first round of the May 29th presidential elections, the National Electoral Council stated that the audits would focus on the review of the entire computer system, while sentencing that the cost of the audit would be borne primarily by the National Registry. Colombia's Supreme Court approved the extradition request of Dairo Antonio Usuga, known as Otoniel, by the government of the United States, where he is wanted for drug trafficking-related crimes. The extradition request was made on November 2, 2021 by the U.S. District Courts of South Florida and New York, where Usuga is being investigated. The prosecutor's office reported that 122 arrest warrants and 7 security measures had been issued on Otoniel for charges of homicide, kidnapping for extortion, and conspiracy to commit a crime. Peruvian authorities reported 1 dead and 15 injured during a day of protest that took place on Wednesday morning in the country. A farm worker participating in the blockade of the Pan American Highway lost his life during a clash involving police and protesters in the Ica region, some 300 kilometers from Lima. The incident occurred while uniformed officers were trying to clear the Pan American Highway. The clash wounded 15 people, among them 12 policemen and 3 civilians. One of the victims was seriously injured. The Bolivian ambassador in the Netherlands, Roberto Calzadilla, made a statement regarding the dispute between Chile and Bolivia over the Silala waters.
Stage of the public hearings. The next stage will be the interrogations and cross-examinations of the experts on the scientific studies, research presented by both countries. Tomorrow, Thursday, the experts from Chile will be called to testify. Our lawyers will interrogate first, and then it will be the turn of Chile. On Friday, the experts from Bolivia will be called. The hearings are called for 15 hours of Netherlands.
In Ecuador, authorities informed that 20 inmates killed on Sunday in a violent riot in the Turi prison were identified. The head of the government's Human Rights Secretariat, Bernanda Ordóñez, said that the forensic teams have carried out all the identification procedures, managing to find the identity of the 20 inmates, of whom 15 bodies have already been handed over to their families. She also informed that logistical aspects were coordinated to facilitate the transfer of the coffins to other provinces where the victims were from. Sunday's riot in the city of Cuenca, capital of the province of Azuay, was the first to be recorded this year, following a wave of prison riots in 2021 that left 331 inmates dead, as part of the serious crisis facing the prison system in Ecuador. In Venezuela, the 16th National History Congress, on its 3rd international edition, is underway in the historic center of La Guaira state. Event organizers say around 700 papers have already been submitted, and there are more than 1,000 registered participants. The organizers say that the public can go to the historic center of La Guaira and on Bolivar Street to enjoy lectures, debates, and cultural and recreational activities, which are also part of the event. Likewise, the organizing committee said this edition will focus on the civil-military rebellion of February 4, 1992, and the 20 years passed since the Popular Rebellion of April 13, 2002, for those are two of the most important events in Venezuela's contemporary political history. And during the development of this Congress, Professor Humberto González from the Luis Bicot International Center for Decolonization Studies emphasized that capitalism seeks to erase the history of the peoples.
Capital's game and in the capital's discourse to forget. This game of forgetting is a systematic game and it's a fundamental game for the self-construction of the system of domination. Because the game of oblivion is the game of depersonalization of peoples. People are people as long as they remember themselves and have their history and their narrative.
Authors from around the world participate in the International Writers' Congress in Puerto Rico with debates and a book fair. Sponsored by the Cervantes Institute, authors from Mexico, Colombia, Spain, Peru, and other nations converge today at the Fine Arts Center in the city of Caguas to exhibit the first International Congress of Writers. During a press release issued by the group managing the initiative, they informed about the development of master conferences, workshops, and roundtables with the participation of the Puerto Rican Helena San Pedro and the Spanish José Manuel Fajardo. The event, which also offers spaces for debate as well as a book fair and text signing events, is conceived as an opportunity for dialogue on the development of the world of letters today. Let's take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. In Brasilia, thousands of indigenous Brazilians continue their week-long demonstration to demand their rights and protest against Jair Bolsonaro's government, which seeks to keep the extractive activities. Indigenous people are camping out this week in an event to protest against the government, which tries to move forward with the economic exploitation of their territories. With their colorful feather headdresses and traditional dances, representatives of different indigenous peoples occupy a large open field near the seat of the presidency to say that Bolsonaro came to power with his promise not to demarcate not one more centimeter of land for indigenous people, whose reserve occupy 13% of the territory. His government is now trying to fast-track several bills harmful to indigenous peoples and the environment, including to legalize mining in their reserves. Next Sunday, 93 million people are called to participate in the first recall process to be held in Mexico. Recent polls show that the majority of the population is in favor of the continuity of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who promoted this exercise of direct democratic participation. From Mexico City, our correspondent Eduardo Martinez with the details.
Mexicans participating in this process of recall referendum is an unprecedented event. The possibility of a citizen participation exercise of this nature is the result of the reform approved by Congress in 2019.
We have had many bad presidents, and it will be very good to cut their terms, regardless of whether or not I agree with the president.
The people can decide to remove the ruler if they think he or she is not doing a good job. It is something historical. Fortunately, we are a generation that has lived through a lot of bad governments.
Next Sunday, April 10th, Mexicans over 18 years of age and registered in the National Voter Registry are called to participate in the first recall referendum. The National Electoral Institute declared itself ready for the day and accused the promoters of the process of putting obstacles in the way of its realization.
Despite the repeated attempts of some political actors to hinder and hamper the proper development of this unprecedented exercise by denying the EIN the necessary resources by repeatedly contesting the decisions that have been made and violating the rules that they themselves established in the Constitution.
However, those promoting the recall referendum have accused the presiding councillor of being in conspiracy with the opposition. The result of this, they say, is the decision to install only 30% of the more than 160,000 polling stations established by law and the lack of publicity for the recall referendum.
They have not been able to create a national pride either. I think that is the underlying problem, an alternative to that of López Obrador. What they have done is to try to immediately sabotage everything that the president says or does, centralizing in the figure of the president, and that is how they lost last year 11 of the 15 states of the republic, and they did not achieve which was their objective, to control the majority of the Congress.
A survey published by the newspaper El Financiero, one of the most critical of the actions of the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, indicates that 60% of Mexicans would vote for the continuity of the incumbent executive. Meanwhile, in order for the recall to be effective, participation must exceed 40%, some 37 million people.
Eduardo Martínez, teleSUR, Ciudad de México.
Russia's defense ministry accused Ukraine of sabotaging a pre-agreed prisoner swap and mistreatment of Russian captives. Defense ministry official Mikhail Mizantsev claimed that Kiev also blocked prisoner exchanges.
The plan for today's swap of prisoners of war has been derailed by the Ukrainian side. The list of 251 military troops in the swap has been repeatedly updated during the last 24 hours. The number of POWs has been repeatedly reduced. The list of 38 military personnel agreed at the last stage has been rejected by the Ukrainian side this morning without explanation. The Russian side has all the reasons to suggest that the military of the Russian armed forces who are in captivity are not okay. Furthermore, it's reliably established that Russian military personnel are subjected to torture, violence, bullying, which in their humanity copies the actions of punishers in the years of World War II.
And now we go with our special envoy to Ukraine, Alejandro Kirk, to get a better understanding about what is happening at one of the humanitarian corridors created by the Russian military to help civilians out of Ukraine.
Mariupol. Behind me, a queue of people expecting to receive humanitarian aid from the Russian forces and from the People's Republic of Donetsk. These people are have been the subject of many suffering in the last 3 weeks. Fierce combats have been taking place in this town. Many buildings are destroyed or burned by the combat. They were used as a human shield by the Ukrainian forces and also by the Nazi battalions that were operating here. For the last 8 years, these people did not have the right to their own language. For 8 years, these people under Ukrainian rule were second-class citizens for being ethnic Russians. And now they are afraid. And why they are afraid? Because it is suspected that many Ukrainian spies, many Ukrainian infiltrators are among them, again threatening their lives. And that's why when we speak to them, they say one thing on camera and they say a whole different story out of camera. They won't say the openly the truth because they have lots of fear. And fear, apart from perplexity, apart from this sensation of discomfort, is what we perceive in these faces today in Mariupol.
Thank you, Alejandro, for this information. Now, Rwanda faces soaring food prices since the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out on February 24th. Prime Minister Edouard Ngirente said the heavy reliance on wheat exports has forced the small country to look for an alternative importer. The African nation spent over $44 million in importing 177,740 tons of wheat, up from 159,350 tons in 2019, according to data released by the country's Ministry of Trade and Industry. Data also showed that Russian wheat accounted for the 64% of Rwanda's total wheat imports. The economic analyst Teddy Kaberuka said food prices have significantly gone up over the past 5 weeks and accused the U.S. foreign policy for the Ukraine crisis. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said Wednesday he has urged to declare a ceasefire in Ukraine and invited the leaders of France, Germany and Ukraine to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Budapest. The Hungarian Prime Minister said the Russian President's response was positive in relation to the civilians found dead in the town of Bucha near Kiev. Orban said an independent and fair investigation is required. The Hungarian Prime Minister has been one of Putin's closest allies and reiterated his opposition to the embargo on Russian energy imports on which Hungary highly depends. He also declared that Hungary is prepared to pay for Russian gas imports in rubles. The German government presented a major reform package on Wednesday to boost the construction of renewable energy as part of its efforts to meet its climate goals and become independent of energy imports from Russia. The 600-page Easter package, approved by the cabinet, lays out goals for the expansion of offshore wind and solar power and declares the installation of renewable energy to be overriding public interest. The government also plans to use domestic coal to fill the gap left by the halt to imports from Russia.
The war, the dying, the killing, the brutality in Ukraine has once again clearly shown us how energy policy is also geopolitics, which interests, yes, security interests, are directly as well as indirectly affected by energy policy dependencies. So that this package, this so-called Easter package, can also be read as a response to what the security policy interests of German policy are, namely to make itself independent first of Russian fossil energy imports and then of fossil energy imports in general. In summary, this package will lead to a significant increase in renewable energy. Combined with the other measures that we are taking, we believe that we are taking an important step today to achieve climate protection goals, but also the energy and security policy goals that Germany has to ensure.
We have more news coming up after a final short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Thousands of Sudanese demonstrators marched in the nation's capital and other cities Wednesday in new protest against a military coup that plunged the African country into political turmoil and aggravated its economic woes. The protests represent the latest of a series of efforts by the Sudanese people to demand civil rule from the generals who took power in October. The demonstrators marched in Khartoum and in Omurdam amid tight security around the presidential palace. The army's takeover upended Sudan's transition to democracy after 3 decades of repression and international isolation under authoritarian President Omar al-Bashir. A popular uprising had forced the military to remove al-Bashir and his Islamist government in April 2019. Iran gave the way to the construction of entirely national nuclear centers, which will allow for a breakthrough in the country's nuclear technology. The head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Mohammad Eslami, pointed out that the measure seeks to satisfy the needs of the people in terms of power generation. The official went on to point out that the coordination studies carried out in scientific and research centers will help the country to achieve a better level in the field of power plants. Eslami added that the fuel monopoly was broken by Tehran by developing a completely national cycle. The Israeli government lost its majority after a member of parliament withdrew from the coalition. The deputy Edith Zellman from the ultranationalist Yamina party, led by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, announced that she was withdrawing her support for the coalition and that she would work for the formation of a new government. According to local media, the maneuver could be orchestrated by former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, now leader of the opposition bloc, who would be plotting strategies to overthrow the coalition and gather support to form an alternative government. Bennett's government now holds 60 out of 120 seats in parliament, will only be able to pass laws depending on the support of opposition parties. The situation could lead to new elections, which will be the 5th in a little more than 3 years. On Wednesday, Pakistan's Supreme Court continued the hearing of petitions seeking to undo the dissolution of parliament by Prime Minister Imran Khan, which set the stage for snap elections. The court has been hearing arguments from Khan's lawyers and the opposition since Monday and will announce a decision ASAP. The legal battle started on Sunday when Khan's ally and Pakistan's Deputy Parliament Speaker Qasim Suri dissolved the National Assembly to sidestep a non-confidence vote that Khan appeared certain to lose. The opposition claimed this was against the Constitution. Khan accuses the United States of helping his political opponents in their plans to oust him, saying Washington wants him gone because his foreign policy favors Russia and China. The U.S. denied the accusations. The Nigerian government eased most of the remaining COVID rules, which included a nighttime curfew and limitations on gatherings. A document from the presidency stated the end of most of the COVID-19 rules, taking into account the decrease in the number of cases and citing a reduction in the risk of new variants arriving on the territory, as well as the availability of vaccines. The document included the elimination of the limits on attendance for social gatherings. Citizens were encouraged to refrain from non-essential movement, and wearing masks remains mandatory for indoor activities. Nearly 20 million Nigerians received at least one dose of vaccines, but only 6.3% of the total population was fully vaccinated, according to figures released by the authorities. On Wednesday, China reported over 20,000 COVID-19 cases, the highest daily tally given since the start of the pandemic, with Shanghai the heart of the virus surge despite being in lockdown. Until March, China kept daily cases low with snap localized lockdowns, mass testing, and strict restrictions on international travel, but the caseload hit thousands per day in recent weeks. Local authorities say they detected a mutation of the highly transmissible Omicron variant near Shanghai. The National Health Commission stated that there were no new deaths and the majority of the cases are asymptomatic. State broadcaster CCTV reported that the city will launch a fresh round of tests on the entire population on Wednesday. We have come to the end of this newsroom. Remember, you can find this and many more stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.